Hey everyone, Rose here, and it's time for another 3D character series. In this series, I'll be showing you my process on this model of Taylor and Aya I made as a commission from start to finish, mostly in Blender. Today's video is going to be on the high poly sculpt, and over the next couple of weeks, I'll be uploading videos on the retopology, rigging, UV unwrapping, baking, and materials. Unlike the last model I made, Plushmallow, this one's gonna be quite low poly because it's gonna be used for VRchat. That being said, I'm not including any of the technical VRchat specific stuff in this playlist, mostly because I'm still figuring it out myself and I haven't really been recording the process. These videos aren't meant to be beginner tutorials, so I won't be explaining the basics of Blender or anything like that. I'm mostly just showing off my overall workflow and how I approach different parts of the process or solve different problems that I might run into. That being said, if you have specific questions about the process, feel free to leave them in the comments below or join the Discord and ask them there. I'm always happy to try and help as much as I can. Anyway, with that all being said, on to the sculpt. The first and, in my opinion, most important part of the sculpting process is the blocking. In this phase, I use basic shapes to make sure the silhouette and proportions and all that are correct before I move on to any detailing or actual sculpting. For the torso, I use two spheres and shape them with a snake hook tool. For the legs, as well as the tail and later the arms, I use a single vertex, add a skin modifier and a subdivision surface modifier, and then extrude it into the shape I want. I can also use Shift A to adjust the thickness of the individual parts. For the arms and legs, I also added a mirror modifier and set the mirror object to the torso, that way I don't have to worry about keeping everything symmetrical. Next, I do the neck. For that I just duplicate a bit of the tail, that way I don't have to redo the whole skin modifier situation. Then I add in the head. For that I just use a basic sphere, and a second one that I use the snake hook tool again to shape into the snout. Then I add another sphere, this time with a mirror modifier, and shape that into the general shape of the ears. Next, for the feet, I duplicate a bit of the lower leg and shape that the way I want it. Now I add in two more spheres, both of them with mirror modifiers set to mirror around the torso. One is going to be the palms later on, and the other I shape into her chest. Again, for both of them, I use the snake hook tool to get them into the shape I want. That's probably the tool I use most early on during the blocking phase while I'm still adjusting the overall shape of different objects. For the fingers, I just use skin modifier objects again, duplicate them and adjust the length for each. Then I remesh the palm and use the crease and clay strips brush to add a bit more shape to it. At this point, the first phase of blocking, at least for the body, is done. I have all the individual pieces in place and I'm quite happy with how the proportions look. So it's time to go into a bit more detail. I duplicate the ears to make the tufts of fur around her cheeks and add a bit more shape to her face. Then I move on to the torso and use my crease and clay strips brush as well as the smooth brush to adjust the overall volumes, add some creases, and overall smooth out the surface. Since it's a 3D model, it's also really important to look at it from different angles and make sure it looks right from everywhere. Now it's time for the hair. I duplicate a bit of the tail since that already has my skin modifier and subdivision surface modifiers on it, and use that to shape the little piece of hair she has hanging in front of her face, as well as the rest hanging down towards the back. I also duplicate that piece and add a mirror modifier to give it a bit more volume. I go around making sure everything looks right again for a moment, and then I head back up to the face, this time towards the ears. I remesh them and then use the clay strips brush to hollow out the inside of the ears. For this part, I also turn on dynamic topology for a second since I'm making drastic changes. Once they're hollowed out, I use the crease brush and the smooth brush to smooth out the edges and make sure everything looks nice and clean. Now down to the feet. I add in a sphere, duplicate it, and use the snake hook tool to shape them into toes. These are really cool to have in the blockout, however they didn't actually end up being super helpful when I did the detailing later on. Now back up to the face. It's time to add in the eyes, so I hollow out where they're gonna be and add in a sphere and move it into place. I also now use my crease brush to shape out the brows and cheekbones. After making some more tweaks around the face, I head back to the torso and use the crease brush to add a bit more detail there. I also make some more tweaks to the hands, adjusting the thickness of the fingers and adding a bit more detail to the palm. Now I add in some tufts of fur into the ears. I use the whole skin modifier situation for this again. And I add more detail to the snout. I use the crease brush to define the mouth and the nose. It took a couple of attempts, it didn't quite look right the first time, but eventually I ended up with something I like. Sticking with the face, the next thing I make is the eyelids. I duplicate the eyeballs for that, then carve out the general shape of the eyelids with that, using the crease brush to define the edges. Then I move back to the snout for a bit and make a few more tweaks there. Sometimes I struggle a bit with long snouts like this on Antho characters because I'm never quite sure how everything has to connect up. But onto something else for now. I tweak the ear fluff a bit and then go back to the hair to make some more major changes. I know I'm gonna have to retopologize this character later on, so I'm trying to figure out if there's perhaps a way that I can spare myself that part of the process, or at least make it easier. Eventually I decide to make the side bits a bit smaller, tweak them a bit, and then boolean everything together. From here I can go into edit mode and then make some tweaks and make sure everything is connected up properly and has decent topology. That didn't end up being quite as quick and easy as I had expected, because they boolean together a bit awkwardly and like the vertices weren't quite in the places where I expected they would be. But with a bit of finagling and a few extra edge loops here and there, I eventually ended up with something that worked out. As is, this obviously doesn't look particularly great, but this isn't how it's gonna stay. I add a multi-resolution modifier and now I can start sculpting in more detail, just having to stick to this overall basic shape, which is gonna be fine. This way I'm not gonna have to retopologize it when I'm done, I can just use the original topology I'd made or maybe even subdivide it once. Either way, I think it's gonna be way quicker than having to retopologize something that I sculpted purely from a low poly without considering the underlying topology beforehand. I pretty much just use the crease brush and the smooth brush to add in some like creasy hair details. Now that piece on its own doesn't really look that great, it's a bit plain and boring, but that's fine because it's really just a base for the curved hairs that are gonna make up most of the detail. I use NURBS curves down the length and add in a Bezier circle that I use to adjust the profile. When making curved hair, some people use another curve to set the taper of the individual hairs, but I don't really like doing that, it doesn't really work that well for me. Instead, I use Alt-S to adjust the thickness of each segment manually, that way I have a bit more control over how the taper is gonna look. The great thing about curves is I'm not going to have to retopologize them, I can simply convert them into mesh and decimate them a little bit. That also means I don't have to worry about keeping them symmetrical for ease of work. The only reason I would have to keep them symmetrical would be UV space, and I'm not super worried about that. Here you can see me make some more tweaks to the bevel object to add a bit more fun, interesting shapes to the hair. That's one of the things I really enjoy about using curves for hair. You can mess around with the style and overall look really quickly and easily without having to spend a whole bunch of time sculpting and trying out different stuff. Anyway, I continue making some more tweaks, adding more strands and moving them around until I'm happy with how it looks. I actually completely finished the hair this early on. while the rest of the body is still very early in the blocking phase. I generally like having the final colors already kind of visible in the viewport while I'm sculpting, so I add in a new material for the hair and change the viewport color to red. And with that done, I move on to the hair in the front. I apply all the modifiers I had on it and then go into edit mode and reduce the number of edge loops just a little bit. When I'm happy with how that looks, I add on another multi-resolution modifier and go back in with my crease brush and the smooth brush and add in detail kind of the way I did in the back. The tip is a tiny little bit awkward, but you'd have to zoom in really close to notice it, so it's not super bad. Just like with the hair in the back, this is really just a base, and I'll be adding in some more curves to add a bit more detail and make the silhouette and stuff a bit more interesting. Though in this case it's not going to be as completely covered in curves as the hair in the back was. And with a couple more tweaks and a good look from all different angles, the hair is completely done. I decide to work on the tail next. I give it the red material too because it's also red in the reference. In most of the references the tail maw is also open, so I apply all my modifiers and go into edit mode and open it. I use V to separate the top and bottom vertices, and then I manually fill in the resulting holes. Next, I select the interior faces and extrude them in to hollow out the inside of the mouth more. And I also add in another subdivision surface modifier just to smooth stuff out a bit. The tail maw also has a really long tongue, so I add that in too. I use the whole skin modifier situation for that again, extruding a single vertex out until I'm happy with the length, adding a skin modifier and a subdivision surface modifier, and then just adjusting it till I'm happy with how it looks. I also use the skin modifier situation for the teeth, this time adding in another mirror modifier with the mirror object set to the tail. I use Shift A to adjust the thickness to make sure the tips of the teeth are narrow, and then I just duplicate them around so it has a bunch of teeth. Once I'm done with the lower jaw, I just duplicate that and flip it up to make the teeth at the top. Now I take the turquoise material that I had made for the tongue and assign that to the vertices on the inside of the tail. That isn't gonna match it much as soon as I remesh it, but I like having it there. Speaking of which, I also make a new material for the rest of the body. But that's not what I'm gonna be working on next, so back to the tail. I add in a sphere and use the snake hook tool to shape that into the rough shape of like a tuft of fur. The tail is super fluffy on all the references I have, and I'm not quite sure at this point how exactly I'm gonna do that, especially given how complicated doing all the fur was on the last model, and the fact that this one is gonna be really low poly so that it can be used in VRchat, so I can't really just go out and retopologize a whole bunch of individual tufts of fur. That wouldn't be good for my own sanity, and that wouldn't be good for the final model. Still, I go around adding skin modifier bits all around the model. I don't pack them as densely like I'm actually trying to make the whole thing fluffy. I'm more just spreading them around to kind of imply the whole shape of kind of fluff. I also duplicate the tufts I had on the top jaw to the bottom too, so that also looks fluffy. Anyway, to spare myself the insanity that is trying to retopologize all these sticky outy hairs, I'm trying as much as possible to have the hairs that I make, like the tufts of fur, kind of lay parallel to the body and not really sticking out super far at the end, so I can pretty much just go over them later while retopologizing without having to give them like extra geometry or something like that. They're still sticking out quite a bit at this point, but later on I go in and flatten them out way more to the point where I can really just go over the whole tail as if they weren't even there, which is cool. Anyway, I continue to go around arranging and adding more and more tufts of fur. In hindsight, I could have really just like sculpted them on in sculpt mode rather than taking the whole time to arrange them like this as extra objects, but I'm still figuring out my whole process, so that's just how it is. Anyway, I'm happy with how it looks at this point, so I move on to other parts of the body again. I'm not doing anything specific at this point, I'm just kind of going around and tweaking everything that I already have. I make some adjustments to the feet, I go up to the legs and add another subdivision surface modifier on top of them to smooth them out a bit more. I make a bunch of tweaks to the torso, adjusting the anatomy there, and just generally find anything that I'm not quite happy with and just make adjustments there, tweak stuff, and just make sure everything looks good. In my opinion, that's one really important part of the sculpting process. Not getting stuck on doing like individual parts for super long, but making sure to take a step back and look at the overall picture, like how everything looks together, and making tweaks and adjusting stuff to make sure everything really works out. I struggle a little bit with the anatomy, especially around the torso. I actually want to spend some time like really studying and practicing anatomy, but I haven't gotten around to it in quite a while. It still ends up looking pretty alright in my opinion anyway, so I go around and do something else for now. I duplicate a bit of the arm, which still has the skin modifier on it, unlike some of the other parts, and make that into a sleeve. I also take a cube and add a solidify modifier and a subdivision surface modifier and kind of model that into the rough shape of a jacket. Since I'm pretty much done with blocking the body at this point, I wanted to also have the clothes blocked out too. For one, as a bit of a progress update for the commissioner, and also just like for myself to kind of take a step back and see how everything's going. I give the jacket a separate material just so like it sticks out and looks distinct from the rest of the body. I also struggled quite a bit making the collar bit for the jacket. I don't really know why, but it didn't really matter super much because I end up pretty much completely redoing it anyway when I head to the final sculpt. Since the sleeve was just a duplicated bit of skin modifier, it didn't have any thickness to it, so I applied the skin modifier, deleted the faces at the ends, and added a solidify to it too, so that it also had a bit of thickness. With the jacket blocked out, the next thing I do is the tank top. For that, I just duplicate a bit of the jacket, give it a different colored material, and just like shrink wrap it over the body. It doesn't have to look particularly good, it just has to have the rough shape of a tank top, just kind of to block it out to make sure everything looks alright. This one didn't take as long as the jacket, and there also wasn't really anything particularly complicated about it. And next I do her jeans. I start out with a subdivided cube for that, and give that a solidify modifier too, as well as a mirror modifier, and then just kind of model the general shape of the jeans around her legs. The only thing that is a bit complicated about this whole blocking process is making sure it doesn't overlap too much with the body. but I end up getting it to work pretty much alright, so that turned out fine. And with the jeans in place, the blocking for this model is finally completely done. At this point it doesn't necessarily look super good, but all the proportions are in place and I have a way better idea of how this is gonna look. From here I can now start refining the model, adding more detail, smoothing stuff out and cleaning stuff up, as well as merging all the different pieces together. I start with the torso. I joined the boobs to the rest of the torso earlier on and I just remeshed it and smoothed out the transition, and then I went on with the crease brush and stuff to add a bit more definition and detail all over that. Next I moved on to the arms. The shoulders weren't really super defined, so I grabbed another object and carefully shaped that into the shape of the top muscles there around the shoulder and added that in for a bit more shape. Now I go back and forth for a while, going through different objects and different parts of the body, where I still need some adjustments to the shape before I merge everything together and start smoothing stuff off properly. I do that for the tail, I adjust the arms a little bit, and the legs, as well as the torso a lot. I also make some tweaks again to the blocking that I did of the shirt and the trousers, though I don't really do much with them at this point yet. Now for the hand, I sculpt a bit more detail into the palm until I'm completely happy with how it looks, and then I grab the fingers and apply the modifiers on them and merge them with the palm too. I also remesh at a relatively high resolution to get everything together and not have any weird connectivity between the fingers or something where I don't want it. I find hands quite hard to sculpt, especially all the joints and the creases and stuff like that, and even just the overall shape. But what I find quite helpful for them is just looking at my own hands and moving them around, looking at them from different angles, or even just looking at pictures off Google or something like that. Just generally getting references to get a better idea of how stuff should look. Either way, after a bit of finagling and figuring stuff out, I eventually ended up with something that I was quite happy with, which is always good. As usual for this part, I use pretty much just the crease brush and the clay strips brush. The crease I used for all the creases and the sharper edges and stuff like that, where I wanted to define the shape a bit more, and the clay strips I used every once in a while when I wanted to adjust the volume. I also obviously use the smooth brush every once in a while to smooth, almost after every brush stroke, but for that I always just hold shift rather than actually navigating to where the smooth brush is. With the hands done, I do the arms. I pretty much just add in the elbow and the inside of the elbow. There isn't really much to adjust in terms of the shape, everything is relatively simple. This isn't a particularly muscular character, so I don't have a whole lot to worry about. And now back to the hand for a few minor tweaks. At this point, the entire upper body is pretty much done. I'm just gonna need to join everything together and remesh it. But before that, I want to make a couple of adjustments, tweaking the neck a bit and making sure all the transitions and the shapes work out well. And then I head down to the legs, specifically the feet. I remesh them and try and start sculpting in the details of the toes and stuff like that. I thought this would be really quick and easy since I had already blocked in the shape of the toes with the separate objects, but I found they were looking a bit odd, so I tweaked around for quite a while, especially when it came to adding the paw pads and just defining the individual toes, and it ended up taking quite a bit longer than I thought. For the paw pads, I outlined them with a crease brush and then used the inflate brush to make them nice and round. The central paw pad was relatively straightforward, though I had a couple of issues with the toes, especially when it came to how to position them. They look pretty good from the bottom, but I really wasn't sure how they should look from the front. I also had a bit of trouble making the foot look flat from the side, so it didn't like have weird rounded bumps if the character was like walking or something like that. That wouldn't really make much sense. I spent quite a while like smoothing them out completely and redoing them, and like going from the side with the snake hook tool to completely adjust the shape and make sure everything looked right from the side. And just generally I struggled quite a bit to make sure that they looked right from all angles, kind of. At one point I even went back to an older save file to re-import the foot the way I had it before, with all the like individual loose pieces, to give it another go completely from scratch. Speaking of previous versions, that's also a really important thing in my opinion while sculpting. Don't just save frequently, but also save different iterations. So when you're about to do something like really big, or that changes a bunch of stuff that you can't really undo easily, definitely go and save just a secondary version. So like sculpt, sculpt 1, sculpt 2. You can always delete them later, but if you do something wrong or mess something up, it's really good to have a previous version to go back to, rather than having to like dig through and hopefully find an autosave that may or may not be there, or to have to completely start from scratch. That really sucks, so definitely save several versions so you can go back when you need them. Anyway, attempt number 2 of sculpting paws is going a lot better at this point. I'm still having a little bit of difficulty making sure stuff looks good from both the bottom and the front, but it's going a lot better than last time. Plus, at this point I know that she's gonna have claws on her feet too, so it's not as bad if it's slightly off without the claws. I take a step back occasionally to make sure the whole composition still looks good and it's not just looking alright up close, but I'm pretty happy with how this is going. So I move on to the legs for a bit. Similar to the arms, the legs are pretty much good as they are from the skin modifier setup, so I just remesh them and sculpt in the knees and the back of the knees. And again, I go around all over the place, tweaking small things here and there, moving stuff around and making sure everything looks good together. At this point the whole body is coming together quite nicely and I'm quite happy with how this is going. Next up is the face, which is always really important. I join all the parts of the face together except for the ears and remesh them at a relatively high resolution. Then I go around mostly with my crease brush, but also a little bit with the snake hook tool, and move stuff around, sharpen all kinds of edges, especially like the brow and the eyelids, adding a little bit of a crease under her eye so that she has a more defined lower eyelid, and just working around making sure everything works together quite well. I had done a pretty good job for the block out, so there wasn't really that much left to do in the actual sculpting for the face. I really just had to smooth out the transition between all the separate objects and add a couple of details and creases here and there. There wasn't really that much left to do on them, but I carved out the inside of the ear a little bit deeper than it already was, and just went around smoothing it and sharpening the shape a bit more. I also did some work on the little tufts of fur inside the ears. Similar to the way I did the hair earlier on, I added a multi-res modifier and just added in a little bit more detail into the sculpt. Now for a little bit of extra detail around the eyes, I add in eyelashes and eyebrows. I add a plane and extrude it along the edge of the eye with snapping turned on and set to faces. And then add a solidify modifier and a subdivision surface modifier and extrude it out a bit, and boom, I have eyelashes. I also take a little extra bit and duplicate that around the bottom edge of the eye to make like smaller like individual eyelash hairs for the bottom. Then I follow the same process and make eyebrows. Now for the eyes themselves. They're a bit spooky and empty, so I assign the faces that I want to give color and assign them a new material. I make 2 materials and separate the eyes into 2 separate objects, since she has 2 different eye colors. And now down to the tail. I had been putting that off for quite a while. As I said earlier, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with it. But I decided to join all of the separate objects together that made up like the tufts of fur and the main kind of body, let's say, of the tail. And I remesh everything and start adding in some more details. I start by using the default draw brush and kind of painting in extra bits of fur in between the bigger tufts that I'd modeled earlier. But I'm not quite sure about how that looks at this point. Next, I address the tongue. I apply all the modifiers I had on it and add a crease down the middle. I also remesh it a couple of times so I can mess with the volume better. For this part of the process, I use the inflate brush a lot. That's nice to like adjust the thickness of thin cylindrical objects that you might have at some point in your scene. It's really practical for that, and it doesn't like mess around with the smoothness too much. Now back to the body, since I'm not really sure what to do with the tail. I take all the objects that were separate up until now and join them together and remesh. With so much geometry from all the separate objects, the model is a bit too high poly to like run smoothly, so I make several face sets so that way I can just hide the parts that I'm not directly working on. Though that being said, be careful as soon as you unhide them again. Look at the transition very closely to make sure you don't have like any weird fine line or crack looking things from where you hid one part, because obviously while it's hidden you can't edit it, so if you edit some part close to the edge you'll end up with a weird like line between the parts you've been editing and the parts you didn't. Anyway, since I had already pretty much finished sculpting all the individual parts, I really just needed to go around all the transitions and make sure they were properly smoothed out and there weren't any like weird borders or edges from where I had joined two separate objects. That worked out pretty well and pretty quickly for the body, so I went on and did that to the head and the ears. I just joined them together, remeshed them at a relatively high resolution, and then smoothed out the transition, making sure to fix like any sharp creases or small details that got lost while remeshing. Back to the body, I go around everything and make sure everything looks right. There's still a couple of spots that need a bit of smoothing out, and there are a couple of like joints and stuff that aren't quite as clearly defined as I would want them because they used to be separate objects, so I go around and do that. I don't join the tail to the rest of the body yet, because I'm not quite yet happy with how it looks and I still need a while to experiment and figure stuff out, so I'll merge it once I've figured that out. For now, I go around the body as well as the face a little bit and make sure everything looks good, smooth out points that still need smoothing out and fix up some minor details before moving on to the next part of the process. And it's time for the clothes. I start with a tank top and I'm going to be doing most of the sculpting using multi-resolution. But first I want to get a decent base, so I apply one level of the subdivision surface modifier and shrink wrap it to the body. Then I apply my mirror modifier and the shrink wrap modifier and use the inflate brush in sculpt mode to separate things from the body so that I don't have like weird overlapping bits, but I also don't have stuff sticking way too closely in a way that doesn't really make sense. Once I'm happy with that, I add my multi-resolution modifier, subdivide a couple of times, and then start adding in all the folds and wrinkles. I use the draw brush to block in where I want folds and wrinkles to be. I also have the pressure sensitivity set to both size and strength, that way they fall off in a quite natural way when I use my brush strokes. Then, when I'm happy with the position of the folds, I use the crease brush to sharpen the creases between the folds and to sharpen the folds themselves. I have a bunch of references open of tank tops and just different cloth in general to give me a better idea of how fabric like this kind of falls and how it sticks to the body and where which kind of wrinkles are. However, this is a stylized model, so I'm not sticking 100% to how it looks in reality. I'm stylizing some stuff and simplifying it down. I like how the folds and wrinkles and all that are turning out, but I'm not quite sure about the overall shape of this tank top. So I'm taking a break from it for a while and working on the jeans instead. Just like with the tank top, the first thing I do is add a shrink wrap modifier to make sure everything sticks to the body nicely. It takes a bit of tweaking to make sure everything sticks properly in between the legs, but eventually I get it to something I like. So I apply the shrink wrap modifier as well as the subdivision surface modifier and start sculpting. I also added a new solidify modifier on top of it. I haven't really messed around with the hair for quite a while, so I go up and take a look at it and see if I still like it. But it's all looking fine, so I get back to the trousers. Now I add on a multi-resolution modifier as well as a solidify modifier after it. And I open up a bunch of references of jeans to get an idea of how the fold should look, but also how it's constructed in general. So I start adding in the major seams. There's one going around the side, around the outside. There are the pockets. There's one going around between the legs from the front all the way down to the back. There's this whole spot where the zipper is and all that good stuff. I actually took some inspiration from the character creation course on the Blender Cloud here. I watched bits and pieces of the time-lapse of rain to get an idea of how other people approach sculpting clothes like this. I make the back pockets by outlining them with my clay strips brush and then smoothing them over. I add more creases and folds, this time to the back of the knee and a couple to the front. I also add some around the back as well as the front of the upper thighs. I also add in this area where the zipper is gonna go. I'll add a button to that later. I add the seam that goes down the inside of the legs and then add a couple of folds and wrinkles to the bottom of the jeans since it's not going to be super tight fitting there. In general for the jeans I use the clay strips brush to add in around the seams and stuff where I wanted stuff to be lifted up a bit, and I use the crease brush to outline and sharpen the edges. I also switch between turning symmetry on and off, since the jeans aren't perfectly symmetrical. I had quite a lot of fun with this part of the process. I don't make clothes very often, but sculpting folds and wrinkles like this is quite enjoyable, it turns out. Though that doesn't mean it was easy. It took quite a lot of back and forth and tweaking stuff until it looked quite right. Speaking of which, the tank top. I had mentioned earlier that I wasn't quite sure I liked how it looked, and I decided I wanted to start over. I turned the subdivisions in the multi-resolution modifier down and then deleted the higher versions and subdivided it again and started over with a new sculpt. This time I wanted to make it a bit more form-fitting, which I felt made a lot more sense for the tank top. The previous version was kind of loose around the top, but then still relatively tight around the bottom, and in fact tight enough to form wrinkles around her waist, which really wouldn't make sense. So for this version I stuck a bit more closely to the different references I had open and let it stick a lot closer to her body. That made it look a bit more like an elastic, snugly fitting tank top as opposed to a weirdly loose one that's cut in an almost cone-like shape. Like with the jeans, I tried to add the seams in here, though I struggled a bit with adding the seams along the top because I was sculpting so close to the edges. Still, it was definitely worth starting over on this one. I liked the second version a lot more and it didn't even take that long. Now I just go around, smoothing stuff out, adding a few more creases here and there, and just tweaking stuff until I'm happy with how it looks for both the tank top and the jeans. And now for the final piece of this model, the jacket. The first thing I do is remove the collar because it's getting in my way. Then I start working on merging the body with the sleeves. I make a hole in the body, apply the subdivision surface modifier, and then go about bridging the gap between the two. Like with the tank top and the jeans, the topology doesn't have to be great, it just has to match the shape around about, so that multi-resolution will work for it. Once I'm pretty happy with how this looks, I experiment around with the shrink wrap modifier, though I'm not quite sure whether I'm going to use it or not. I eventually decide against it and just use sculpt mode to stick the model as close as possible to the body without having it overlap too much. I tweak stuff around, make sure the topology works right, and make sure I don't have any super long polygons or something that would get in my way with the multi-resolution modifier. And when I'm happy with it, I apply the subdivision surface modifier I've had on there, add a new solidify modifier, and then add the multi-resolution and start sculpting. Like for all the other clothes, I have a bunch of references open for leather jackets, though they all kind of look very different in terms of how they're cut. Either way, I go around and try and find how the major parts of the fabric are separated and add in some creases there. Next, I add back in the color. In hindsight, I should have probably kept it all in one piece, even though it would have been a little bit more difficult to manage while sculpting, because later the whole process of getting it back together was a bit of a pain. But for now, I just model it. I had snapping turned on to make sure it all stuck around to the surface, and then I turned it off to just bring the color up. I use both sculpt mode and edit mode to adjust the shape and make sure it all lifted in the right direction. It's actually surprisingly complicated sometimes to do something like lift up a collar. But once I had it in place, I went back over to the main body. The collar itself doesn't really need much in terms of detail sculpting quite yet, so I didn't yet add the multi-resolution. For the body, I went on to the sleeves and under the sleeves and started adding in the main wrinkles. I just kind of went back and forth with the regular old draw brush to add them in, and later I went over them with a crease brush to add a bit more detail there. Next, I added in a zipper. For that, I just used the skin modifier setup and extruded it along the edge of the main body part of the jacket and then the collar too, though I change it up later on. Now the model is really coming together. Similar to how I did the body, I keep going back and forth and tweaking different parts of the clothes. But since the tank top and the jeans are mostly done, I stick to the jacket for the most part. At first, I keep symmetry turned on for quite a while, since you aren't really going to see both sides at the same time, or they're far enough away from each other to where you won't really notice that they're perfectly symmetrical. But at some point I turn it off. I keep going around the model, adding in more seams using the crease brush and the clay strips brush where I think there might maybe be seams in a symmetrical fashion. I'm not really a tailor, so I have no clue. I'm just kind of making it in a way that seems like it might maybe make sense. I'm also not sewing in the individual stitches or anything like that. For one, I don't have any brushes for something like that. And also, it's just relatively stylized and not that detailed that you would actually see them. It just really isn't worth it. And with some pockets in place, as well as a bunch of seams and folds and wrinkles, the whole thing is coming together quite well. So I switch up to something a bit different. The mouth of this character needs to be able to open and close, so to make my life a bit easier later on, I go into sculpt mode, mask out the lower jaw and rotate it a bit to open it up. Then in object mode, I add a new object that has around about the shape of the open mouth and use it to boolean out the stretched out bit from the rotating. And I remesh the whole face again, smooth out the inside of the mouth and hollow it out a bit more, and then model in teeth. This isn't the actual footage of me doing that whole process. I accidentally forget to press record, but I just wanted to quickly redo it so you can see what I did. Once I had that whole mouth situation figured out, I added in claws for her fingers and toes, and then just duplicated them around and adjusted like the scale and thickness to fit each finger and toe. At this point it was also finally time to merge the head with the body, so I did that, remeshed, and just smoothed out the transition. There wasn't really much there to be smoothed out, but I still fixed up everything, cleaned up and tightened up any creases or stuff that were in the face that got messed up a bit while remeshing, but that didn't really take long and everything was pretty much fine as was. And now it's finally time to properly address the fur on the tail. I wasn't really sure how I was gonna do it up until now, but I eventually came to a decision. I decided to use the crease brush to go around the edges of all the individual chunks of fur I'd made, both the ones that were separate objects that I had merged together, as well as the ones that I had painted on early on. I wanted to get away from this kind of lumpy look that I had, or this completely sparse with just a handful of small clumps here and there. I wanted it to be still relatively densely packed with clumps, but have those all be distinct, clearly recognizable ones. At first I had kept them round, but eventually I decided to make them pointy, in part because on almost all the paintings I had of them, the fur was quite pointy and more shaggy and not as super cushy and soft kind of looking the way the rounded tips made it feel. So I went around using my crease brush mainly, as well as a bit of smooth, and gave everything little sharp tips and also creases along the top and the sides to just make everything feel very sharp but still fluffy. I also pretty much pushed all of the chunks of fur down to be completely flush with the body. That way I don't have to give them any special attention during retopology. I only left a very small handful of them at the very tip to stick out, so they would be the only thing I'd have to worry about. I decided to leave them since the face on the tail is kind of a secondary focal point of the whole character, and having just a little bit of interesting fluff detail around it is still gonna be nice for the composition and just how it looks in general. Since I was really late on in the process when I decided to use this style of fur, I ended up not getting everything really smooth. The smooth brush tends to run into a bit of an issue when you have too high a resolution. I think it works based on the number of vertices, so when you have a very low poly model, it smooths out really hard, but as soon as you have a very high resolution model, it kind of stays relatively lumpy. Either way, I was concerned that this would cause problems or look awkward in the final model and in the final bake, but luckily everything turned out looking fine, so I am really happy with that. And now the tail is finally done and I merge it with the rest of the body. I also have to redo the symmetry on the teeth because obviously the original object that it was working around is gone. I also go around the body a bit more, making some final tweaks and stuff before I do the final remesh to attach the tail properly. One of the major things I do is hollow out the inside of the mouth a bit more. The teeth also need a bit more love. At this point I've only just box modeled them and added a subdivision surface modifier on them, but they still need a bit of sculpting. But first I do the tongue, because that's quite a lot quicker and easier, because I really just need to sculpt a crease down the middle and it's done. But back to the teeth. I remesh them and sculpt in the gums and the creases in between the individual teeth and all that. And then do the same for the top teeth. I'm not 100% happy with how they look, and I actually ended up redoing them later when I was doing retopology, because they ended up a bit kind of lumpy and just hard to retopologize because of their shape. With the teeth done, the model is pretty much complete. At this point I'm really just going around, smoothing all kinds of stuff out, making some very minor, barely visible tweaks, until everything is just the way I want it. Finally, there's one more or less major thing that I still need to do, and that's attach the collar to the jacket. First, I added a multi-resolution modifier to make sure I had the seams around the edges all sculpted out. Then I made sure that the two pieces overlapped properly, applied all the modifiers on them, and used a Boolean modifier to join them together. Then in sculpt mode I could smooth out the transition and make sure everything fitted together properly. I also used a bit of dynamic topology, especially around the place where the leather kind of bends outward, to make sure everything fits together properly. And then I readdressed the zipper. I had a bit of trouble with this one just because of how it has to flip upside down where the collar bends over. Eventually I just kind of extruded stuff out and manually rotated it into place. And now I add in the last couple of details. I use a cylinder to make a little button that I duplicate around for the top of the collar, and then I duplicate another one of them and use that for the button on the jeans. And with that, the high poly sculpt is done. And here's the final result. I'm really happy with how they turned out, and I learned quite a bit of new stuff during the process. I haven't really messed around with clothes much in the past, as I mentioned earlier, and I also haven't really used multi-resolution in a sculpt, I think, ever. So this was definitely a learning experience for me. I hope you guys also enjoyed this video, and maybe learned something from my process, or at least got some inspiration for your own next character model or whatever you might be making. In my next video, I'll be showing you my retopology process and possibly the rig. I'm not quite sure yet whether I'm gonna include that or not. Either way, if you're interested in that, definitely subscribe and stick around for that one. And if you want to see more of these characters, they belong to Darkflamewolf. I'll try and link her social media in the description below. Anyway, that's all for me for today, and I'll see you all next time. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe and all that, and maybe check out one of my other videos to the right. If you'd like to see more of my art or maybe get a commission from me, I've put links to all that in the description below. And I've also put a link to the Discord server. Anyway, I hope you have a nice day and see you all next time.